Помню свой даже первый полет. Поднялись, с инструктором поднялся и увидел облака, солнце. Мы сверх облаков летели. Это было настолько, было так красиво. Я даже до сих пор все это помню. Я ощущаю, вот, что я лечу, оторвался от земли. Облака вот они, возьми прямо рукой. Солнце светит. Неописуемо красиво.
It wasn't until 1971 that the Aleutian IL-76 was introduced with the Category 2 flight control computer, but the IL-86 brought the Soviet Union into the computer age.
Most of these pilots, at one point or another, flew fighter jets, and if you can land a Sukhoi fighter bomber on an aircraft carrier in the North Sea during the Black Blizzard, in a deep fog, then you could probably land a Tupolev on an airfield during a snowstorm in Stavropol. They like to take that approach pretty steep, but when they actually get down to the tarmac, it's always very smooth.
In 1968, the Tupolev Tu-154 had a 3-channel autopilot that used a system called PKA 25.2. PKA stood for Pilot Complex Automatic. This is a hybrid flight control computer. 3 years later, the IL-76 airliner was introduced with a Category 2 flight control computer that feeds data to a heads-up display. Even with this technology, the Soviet Union would not be able to fly safely to other airports outside the Soviet Union. Outside the Soviet Union, runways have equipment that transmit a frequency that an incoming airplane picks up. This is called the ILS, or Instrument Landing System. The frequency is interpreted by navigational equipment that is displayed as data for the pilots to read, as well as data for the airplane's onboard computers to automatically land the plane. This existed outside the Soviet Union, but Soviet pilots had a different technique for flying to an airport. Russian airliners had similar navigational equipment such as the Pizhma-1 navigational system, but their technology was not compatible with non-Soviet technology. The Pizhma-1 navigation system runs from a Russian database system called GLONASS, which existed mostly in the USSR. Since the 1970s and the 1980s, newer aircraft have been fitted with DCAS, traffic collision avoidance systems. It's a radar to detect airborne traffic and other VOR and DMU receivers, but even this would not be enough to land an airport outside the Soviet Union. This is a modern flight deck of a Tupolev Tu-154. Many of the instruments on board have been refitted to accommodate Category 3 ICAO requirements. These days, the Russian Federation doesn't have to use GLONASS. Their flight plans use GPS intersections from a worldwide database, using Western GPS equipment such as this one manufactured by Allied Signal.
Больше всего нам не нравится сейчас в авиации, это то, что вот эта вот разношерстность. У нас сейчас около 400 авиакомпаний. Ну, к чему это влияет? Это резкое снижение безопасности полета. Русские пилоты всегда были на высоте. Они чувствовали всегда, что безопасность полета – это всего. Для них не существовали там сейчас какая-то коммерция, какая-то это. А сейчас больше захватываются вот эти вот именно коммерческие вот эти соображения. То есть безопасность встает на второе место, а коммерция и бизнес встают на первое место. Вот это нам очень не нравится. Отключение справа, отключение слева.
There's a huge difference between the Russian and the American philosophies about flying. Perhaps it comes from the reputation of their equipment. This airplane was a Tupolev Tu-4, Tupolev's answer to the Airbus. Still today, the majority of airplane crashes are caused by some sort of automatic system not working properly. In the 1970s and the 1980s, American instruments and computer systems were built like a fine watch, precise and reliable. The Russians knew that their computer systems were sometimes untrustworthy, and that's why the pilots didn't rely on them. The Air France Airbus A320 crashed here because the vertical speed control was set to a negative number instead of a positive rate of ascent, even though the altitude control was set to a higher altitude.
Русских пилотов всегда отличало высокое профессиональное мастерство. Русские пилоты никогда не надеются на автоматику. Автоматика – это у них как вспомогательное средство. А вообще пилоты русские летают, как говорится, своим собственным соображением, своими собственными руками.
Под канал. Я всегда думал, вот действительно, как птица летит. Она взмахнула крылом. Что от этого? Почему она вот... Она же все-таки тяжелее воздуха, птица. И все-таки она держится. За счет крылья. И что интересно, наверное, и перья даже помогают вот удержаться птице в воздухе. А как изменяет она курс? Хвостом повернула, крылом повернула. И что самое главное, что перья у нее изменились на одном крыле и на втором. Она развернулась, в другую сторону полетела. Изменила курс. Отказа слева нет.
Двигатели на взлетном. Параметры в норме.
Air travel is becoming safer. The Airbus and the Tupolev 204 are operated by computer systems that make it more difficult to crash. New features with digital displays are designed to be less confusing and more user-friendly to minimize pilot error. Bigger text and visual consistency means that pilots in any country can easily fly the airplane. Since the production of the Tupolev 204, there's very little difference in the Airbus and the Tupolev. This is the flight deck of a Tupolev 204. It looks very similar to an Airbus. Even though the data displayed in the 204 is still written in Cyrillic, the engineering and the design is just as reliable as Airbus. You can see that the design of the flight deck is just as modern as one you'd find in any modern aircraft.